Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping right into a really intense subject. It's the question that's been debated, argued over, the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic.
It really has. It feels less like a straightforward scientific question sometimes, and more like like you said, almost a brawl.
Exactly. And there's such strong feelings on all sides. So our goal today is to unpack the two main theories, the ones that seem most plausible based on what we know.
That's the natural origin market hypothesis,
Yeah.
centered on the Wuhan wildlife market in Wuhan.
Right. And the alternative, the lab leak hypothesis, focusing on the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
And we're going to do this by digging into the latest sources we could find, analyses from big journals like Cell, commentaries from scientists, even opinion pieces looking at, the state of science communication itself.
Our mission really is to pull out the key pieces of information, the insights from all this material, and give you a clearer picture of the evidence where the big uncertainties still lie.
And also why this whole thing has gotten so tangled up with politics and, frankly, public trust in science, which is a huge part of the story.
Absolutely huge. And just to be clear, we're not here picking a side.
No, definitely not. We're just laying out what the sources say, the arguments and the counter-arguments, as neutrally as we can.
Okay, so let's start with the market hypothesis. That was the initial focus, right? The idea that the Han wildlife market was ground zero.
Yes. And we know the virus was there. I mean, that's not really in dispute. Samples taken from stalls, drains, things like that back in early January 2020.
They found SARS-CoV-2 genetic material.
They did. Positive samples.
Hmm.
And that sounds pretty compelling on its own.
It does. I remember hearing about a study in Cell recently that seemed to strengthen this link.
Ah, yes. That analysis claimed the common ancestor of the market viruses was basically the ancestor of the entire pandemic, which, sounds almost like case closed.
Okay, but I sense a but coming. Because it's never that simple with this topic, is it?
Exactly. Here's the big caveat. When those samples were taken.
Right, you said early January 2020.
Weeks after the pandemic was already known to be spreading. And, crucially, none of those positive samples came from a live animal. Not one.
So they found the virus around the market stalls, but not in an animal host there.
Precisely. And maybe even more frustratingly, no samples were collected before the market was shut down, cleaned out, and all the animals were cleared.
Wow. So a critical window was just missed.
Completely missed. Which is why most scientists looking at this call the results suggestive, maybe, but definitely not definitive proof the outbreak started there.
It feels like trying to solve a mystery when the crucial clue was wiped away before anyone could examine it.
That's a good way to put it.
Uh-huh.
And there's another layer here. We know the natural hosts for these kinds of coronaviruses are horseshoe bats.
Okay.
But there are no known colonies of horseshoe bats carrying viruses close to SARS-CoV-2 within, 1,500 kilometers of Wuhan.
1,500. So it's not like the bats were living next door to the market.
Not at all. Which means, even if it came from a bat originally, it had to be brought into Wuhan, brought into the market somehow. Nobody really thinks the virus originated geographically in Wuhan itself.
Which raises another possibility. Could a person have brought the virus into the market rather than an animal?
That's definitely part of the discussion. And it's interesting because when you look at the very early viral sequences, sort of the base of the family tree, many of those came from people who had absolutely no connection to the Wuhan market. Some were even in Wuhan. There was an early cluster in Guangdong province, which is, 800 kilometers away.
That does complicate the simple, it started in the market narrative. But isn't there a historical parallel? Didn't the first SARS outbreak start in a market?
Yes, absolutely. SARS-1 back in 2002, that one did trace back pretty clearly to civet cats being sold in a market in Guangdong.
So historically, it's a very plausible pathway for a new virus to jump to humans.
It lends weight to the idea, certainly. A zoonotic spillover event in a market setting. It happens.
So despite all the gaps and the missing pieces, is there anything more recent that points towards an animal link at the Huanan market? What's the sort of best evidence we have for the market hypothesis now?
Well, something quite significant did emerge, although frustratingly late. In March 2023, the BBC reported on a new analysis pointing towards raccoon dogs.
Raccoon dogs. Okay, tell me about that.
So this involved reanalyzing genetic data that had been collected from the market swabs back in 2020, but hadn't been fully analyzed or released in this way before.
And what did they find?
They found genetic material from raccoon dogs, animals known to be sold live in the market, sometimes for meat, mixed together with SARS-CoV-2 genetic material in the exact same swab samples.
So virus and animal DNA co-located.
Exactly. A researcher, Dr. Florence DeBar, actually spotted these full sequences when they were briefly uploaded to a global database called GISAID. She downloaded them, and as she described it, just saw raccoon dog appearing alongside the virus hits.
Wow. Now, as you said before, that doesn't prove the raccoon dogs were infected, right?
Correct. It doesn't prove infection.
Mm-hmm.
But Dr. DeBar called it the most plausible interpretation. And Professor Eddie Holmes, who was also involved, basically said this is likely the best evidence we will get for an animal origin, even if the actual infected animal, the intermediate host, is long gone. He called it finding ghosts in the genetic data.
Ghosts. That's quite evocative. But what's this about the data being released late?
Well, that's where the frustration comes in. Professor Holmes called it an absolute scandal that this data took 3 years to surface properly. Apparently, it was uploaded to GSide, then taken down again shortly after researchers like Dr. DeBar found it.
3 years? Why the delay? That seems problematic.
Extremely problematic. It led to calls, including for the WHO Director General, Dr. Tedros, for all data related to COVID origins to be shared immediately. Get past the politics, focus on the science.
It really highlights the difficulties when data isn't shared openly and quickly. But Professor Holmes also made a broader point, didn't he, about humans and wildlife viruses.
Yes, a really crucial one. He basically said, look, humans get viruses from wildlife. It's been true throughout our entire evolutionary history. He believes something like this will happen again, and we desperately need better surveillance systems in place.
A sobering thought. Okay, so the market hypothesis. Plausible, historical precedent, some intriguing genetic clues pointing towards raccoon dogs, but still missing that definitive proof and hampered by, well, data issues.
That sums it up pretty well. Now, let's pivot to the other major theory, the one that sparks just as much, if not more, debate. The lab leak hypothesis.
Right. And the starting point for this one is pretty stark, isn't it? The location.
It is. The argument hinges on what many see as an extraordinary coincidence. The pandemic started in Wuhan, a city that just happens to host China's leading coronavirus research lab, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, or WIV.
And it's pretty close to the market area, right? Less than 20 kilometers, I think.
Yes, relatively close. That proximity alone is enough for many people to say, hang on a minute.
But it's not just the WIV itself, is it? Are there other potential lab-related pathways people point to?
There are. For instance, we know scientists from the WIV went on expeditions to collect bat coronaviruses from caves, sometimes far away.
Okay, so sample collection in the field could be one route.
Potentially. And another point often raised is that the Wuhan Center for Disease Control and Prevention, a different facility that also handled coronaviruses, was apparently just a 5-minute walk from the Huanan market itself.
A 5-minute walk.
Wow, okay.
So the argument goes, even if it wasn't a leak from the main WIV building, there were other obvious and plausible alternative routes for a lab-related incident to lead to the first human case near the market.
What's striking, though, is how this idea was treated early on.
Extremely striking. Back in, say, March 2020, very early days, the lab leak idea was almost immediately dismissed as a conspiracy theory.
On what basis? Was there strong evidence against it then? Not really. The dismissal often happened, as some commentators put it, on a bare minimum of evidence. And since then, some proponents of the natural origin theory have been very forceful in rejecting the lab leak idea, calling it fanciful or absurd.
Some even claiming their research lays to rest the lab escape possibility entirely.
Yes, which is very strong language in science, and language that arguably hasn't helped foster open discussion or trust.
Now, let's be clear on the evidence, or lack thereof. Has SARS-CoV-2 itself, the virus that causes COVID-19, actually been found in the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
No, it hasn't. They have acknowledged working with other closely related bat coronaviruses, some of the closest known relatives, in fact, but not SARS-CoV-2 itself, according to official statements.
Okay. But what about intelligence agencies? I know there's been conflicting information coming out of the U.S. government.
That's right. It's become quite public that different U.S. departments and agencies have reached different conclusions based on the intelligence they have, which isn't all public.
And where do things stand now?
Well, notably, the FBI and the U.S. Department of Energy have both stated they now believe a lab leak is the most likely origin. The FBI director even publicly accused Beijing of actively trying to thwart and obfuscate the investigation.
But they haven't released the underlying intelligence behind that conclusion.
No, and that's a source of significant frustration for many scientists who want to see the actual data, the evidence leading to that assessment. It remains classified, as far as we know.
So we have some intelligence agencies leaning towards lab leak, but without public evidence. What about the geographic evidence again? Professor Holmes had a point about where the known early cases were clustered, didn't he?
He did. He strongly argues that the epidemiology, the pattern of early known cases, points squarely to the area around the market. He emphasizes there's not a single piece of data showing any early cases around the laboratory, which is about 30 kilometers away from the market cluster.
So the geography of the initial outbreak we know about still seems centered on the market vicinity, not the lab.
According to Holmes and others analyzing that epidemiological data, yes. Which brings us to this bigger picture. This isn't just about analyzing virus sequences or plotting cases on a map anymore, is it?
No, it really feels like we've moved beyond just the scientific facts. It's become, as we said, heated, brawl-like, and deeply politicized.
Absolutely. And this is where some of the commentary pieces we looked at become really insightful. Jane Q, writing in The Guardian, made a powerful argument.
What was her take?
She argued this whole controversy isn't really a simple left versus right political issue. Instead, she sees it as a symptom of deeply entrenched public distrust of science.
And she points out that public opinion, particularly in places like the US, France, Germany, seems to be shifting more towards favoring lab leak theories.
Even though, as we've discussed, there's no definitive public proof for either theory right now. So the question becomes, why this erosion of trust? What's fueling it?
Well, one obvious factor seems to be the lack of transparency, right? Particularly from China.
Undeniably. The limited data sharing, the reluctance to allow truly independent investigation. It inevitably creates uncertainty and breeds suspicion. When you don't have clear answers, people fill the gaps.
But Q and others also point fingers, maybe more controversially, at the scientific community itself.
Yes. The argument is that some scientists push the natural origin narrative with excessive confidence, especially early on. They showed little tolerance for dissenting views, and sometimes seemed almost eager to shut down the debate.
I remember reading one quote where a virus ecologist said some colleagues defended their theories like a religion. That's pretty strong.
It is.
Yeah.
And this perception of defensiveness or dismissiveness didn't just appear out of nowhere with COVID-19.
You mean there was existing unease about virus research?
Exactly. There was already a storm of public distrust brewing, partly connected to controversies like the H5N1 bird flu gain-of-function research back in 2011.
That's where scientists modify viruses to make them potentially more dangerous, right? To study them?
Correct. And the perception, fair or not, was that virologists and the institutions funding them hadn't done enough to openly address public concerns about the safety and ethics of that kind of work. There was a feeling of insufficient transparency even before the pandemic hit.
Are there specific examples related to the COVID origins debate that commentators highlight as missteps?
Yes, a frequently cited one involves Peter Daszak, the head of EcoHealth Alliance. He helped organize that influential letter published in The Lancet back in February 2020.
The one condemning conspiracy theories about a non-natural origin.
That's the one. The major issue raised later was that the letter didn't disclose Daszak's own organization's significant, long-standing funding and research collaboration with the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
So a potential conflict of interest that wasn't declared when dismissing theories involving that very lab.
Precisely. And then there's the fact that Daszak has denied his group's collaboration involved gain-of-function research, while the lead Chinese scientists at WIV working on bat coronaviruses have actually published work acknowledging they created modified viruses that were more virulent in lab tests.
So conflicting accounts and a lack of disclosure, you can see how that erodes trust.
Absolutely. These are described as errors of judgment at best, but they provide ammunition for those who suspect something is being hidden.
It connects to that point from the social scientist Benjamin Hurlbut. He suggested the problem isn't really an anti-science public.
Right. His argument was it's more that the scientific community sometimes labels people as anti-science or conspiracy theorists when those people are actually grappling with legitimate questions about transparency, conflicts of interest, and, well, trust.
It's a fundamentally different framing of the problem.
It is, and it leads into this broader discussion about science's role in society, especially a divided one. Marcia McNutt, who heads the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, wrote an editorial in Science about this.
What was her main message?
Her core message was that science is neither red nor blue. She really emphasized that science should be apolitical. It's simply the best method we have for understanding the natural world and predicting outcomes based on evidence and natural laws.
Did she talk about how science actually works? Because it's not always neat.
Yes, she stressed that scientists need to do a better job explaining the process of science, that it's built on challenging prior work, finding errors, improving understanding. It's not just about consensus all the time. Disagreement and revision are key.
And she made a distinction between science providing evidence and dictating policy, right?
A crucial distinction. Science gives us the best available evidence, but it cannot dictate what people should value or what political decisions should be made based on that evidence. That's the job of elected officials in society.
That editorial sounded like a call for clarity and maybe humility from the scientific community. How was it received? Were there responses?
Oh yes, Science published several responses that showed a real range of perspectives on this. One came from Manfred Staffoff.
And his view.
He agreed science should be nonpartisan, but he lamented how during COVID, things like vaccine and mask science were clearly weaponized for political statements by politicians on all sides. His advice to scientists was basically, stop being exploited, stop whining, and start actively participating to be that voice of reason in a politicized environment.
Interesting. So engage more, but carefully. What about other responses?
Colm Kelleher offered a slightly different angle. He argued scientists have a special and privileged role in determining truth, and because of that, they need to wield their authority with modesty and self-awareness.
Modesty and self-awareness. How did he suggest achieving that?
His interesting suggestion was to actively foster more ideological diversity on scientific committees, especially those dealing with sensitive issues where social or political values might unconsciously bias things. The idea is that broader perspectives could improve objectivity and public trust.
Ideological diversity on science committees. That's a challenging idea. Was there any pushback against McNutt's core idea of apolitical science?
Yes, a strong counterpoint came from Michael Krauss. He flat out challenged the notion, stating, science is not a view from nowhere.
Meaning what?
Meaning our backgrounds, our experiences, our perspectives, and, yes, even our politics inevitably color and shape what we know and how we choose to study things. He argued that pretending science is totally neutral isn't convincing to skeptics and ignores history.
Did he give examples?
He pointed to things like the history of eugenics or how military funding priorities shape research directions. His point was that values and politics have always influenced science. So, retreating to an ivory tower of supposed neutrality isn't the answer.
So what is the answer, according to Krauss?
He argues scientists need to understand and confront how politics will inevitably continue to shape science rather than pretending it doesn't exist. Acknowledging the influences might be more productive than denying them.
Wow, okay, so that brings us full circle. We've gone from market stalls and raccoon dogs to lab safety and the fundamental relationship between science, politics, and public trust.
It's a lot to cover. And the main takeaway, after all this, has to be that we still don't have that definitive answer on where COVID-19 came from.
No. Despite all the research, all the debate, both the market hypothesis and the lab leak hypothesis still have pieces that fit, and huge, frustrating question marks remaining.
And what this deep dive really underscores, I think, is that searching for scientific truth, especially on something this massive and impactful, isn't some clean, linear process. It's messy.
It's tangled up with global politics, it's deeply affected by issues of trust, and it involves, human scientists with their own perspectives and potential biases.
Which highlights just how vital things like transparency, genuine accountability, and maybe a dose of humility are from the scientific community, especially when the stakes are this high.
Absolutely. Which leaves us and you with a final thought to ponder. If science, as Krauss argues, is never truly separate from values and politics,
then what concrete steps beyond just saying, share more data, should scientists and policymakers actually take to rebuild trust and ensure we get the most objective, useful science possible when the next global crisis hits?
how can the lessons learned, or maybe still being learned, from this whole COVID origins debate be applied proactively? Something to